Welcome back to Shadowed Pages, my dear friends. I'm Edward, and I'm truly delighted to have you join me once again this evening. Where are you tuning in from today, and how has your day been? I always enjoy hearing from you. Leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now let's begin. The morning fog had not yet fully lifted as Miss Marple sat quietly on the park bench near the old post office, watching the bustle of St. Mary's village slowly awaken. The faint chirping of sparrows in the distance seemed to mingle with the occasional rustle of leaves, the soft hum of an approaching car, and the distant clinking of a bicycle bell. Everything in the village, as always, felt peaceful, a slow, almost sleepy rhythm of life. Yet Miss Marple knew better than most that behind the most serene exteriors could lie the most insidious secrets. The post office had stood at the corner of Cross Road for generations. It had served as a hub for the town, not only for sending and receiving letters, but also as a quiet meeting place for the gossip and news that fueled the community's daily life. There was no better place to observe the ebb and flow of human nature, and for Miss Marple, there was no more fitting place to reflect on the strange developments of late. The previous week, a letter had arrived at the post office, addressed only to the old post office. It was peculiar, to say the least. The handwriting was unfamiliar to the staff, and no one seemed to know who could have sent it. But it wasn't just the absence of a return address that piqued the old detective's interest. It was the envelope itself, yellowed with age, the paper a curious blend of something thick and slightly grainy, almost like parchment. When it was opened, inside was a cryptic message: "Find the truth beneath the floorboard." At first, the letter was dismissed as a prank, but when Miss Marple heard about it from the postmaster, she felt a flicker of something, perhaps not quite danger, but certainly intrigue. The post office had long since ceased being the heart of gossip. It now served as little more than a stop for packages, bills, and occasional news clippings. Yet something told Miss Marple that this letter was no ordinary communication. Over the next few days, the village had been abuzz with whispers about the mysterious message. A few of the more curious residents had taken to speculating wildly, each theory more absurd than the last. There were those who imagined it to be some sort of treasure map, a hidden fortune buried beneath the floorboards of the old building. Others insisted it was a remnant of a bygone feud, the remnants of old secrets desperate to be unearthed. But Miss Marple knew that such things were rarely as simple as they appeared. There was something else beneath the surface, something older than the post office itself. Something buried not just in wood and stone, but in the memories of the people who had long since moved away. Her first instinct was to visit the post office that very morning. The building's architecture was a reminder of the past, a quaint stone structure with faded ivy creeping along its walls and large windows that had once allowed passers-by to peer inside. Now, the windows were clouded with dust and the doors locked during the hours the office was not open. The postmaster, Mr. Tompkins, was an elderly gentleman with a tendency to grumble about the good old days. Still, Miss Marple had a certain way of persuading him, gently prodding him into revealing just enough information. When she mentioned the letter, his expression had shifted from indifference to something else. Something like unease. "I've been meaning to speak with you about that, Miss Marple," he said, voice low. "It's odd, isn't it? A letter like that, coming out of nowhere. And then, the floorboards. I don't know. I've had a feeling in my bones ever since it arrived. Like something's been stirred up. Something that shouldn't be." His words were vague, but Miss Marple could tell he was holding something back. Her gaze drifted toward the back of the post office, where an old storage room was tucked away behind the counter. She had been inside it many times, but today, something about it felt different. Perhaps it was her imagination, or perhaps it was just the weight of the mystery settling in her mind. But she sensed that there was more to this place than met the eye. "I'll take a look for myself, if you don't mind," she said, her voice soft but firm. Mr. Tompkins hesitated, clearly reluctant to allow anyone into the more private areas of the building, but Miss Marple's reputation preceded her, and in the end, he agreed with little more than a reluctant nod. The room smelled faintly of old paper and dust, and as Miss Marple's feet echoed softly on the wooden floor, she felt the coolness of the air shift, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Her eyes moved from one corner to the next, scanning the cluttered shelves lined with forgotten crates of letters, dusty accounts, and parcels long abandoned. The sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, casting a pale glow across the room. Everything seemed oddly still. It wasn't until she reached the far end of the room that she noticed it. A small trap door hidden beneath a rug, so inconspicuous that even the most inquisitive of eyes might miss it. She knelt down, her fingers brushing the edges of the door, which creaked faintly as she lifted it. Beneath, a narrow, dark space greeted her, just enough to crawl inside, but not much more. She hesitated for only a moment before lowering herself into the darkness below. Her instincts told her she was on the right track, but she could feel the tension building in her chest, the anticipation of finding something or someone that had been waiting for decades. The air smelled of earth and old wood, and as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, Miss Marple's gaze fell on a box, sitting alone in the corner of the small space. Its surface was scratched and worn, but the seal was still intact. Carefully, she opened it, revealing a collection of faded documents, photographs, and an old, rusted key. There was something else too, hidden beneath the papers, a set of faded letters tied together with a thin piece of twine. The letters had been written in a hurried, shaky hand, their contents too smudged to read easily. As Miss Marple carefully examined the letters, she felt a sudden chill, as though she had unearthed something far darker than a forgotten secret. Something was waiting to be uncovered here, something that had been buried for too long. And with each step, the mystery of the old post office deepened, drawing Miss Marple closer to the truth that lay hidden beneath the floorboards of St. Mary's Village. Miss Marple had always been accustomed to the quiet rhythm of village life, but the discovery in the post office left a ripple of unease that she could not easily shake off. As she emerged from the cramped space beneath the floorboards, her mind raced with questions. Who had left the box? What did the faded letters mean? And why had they been hidden for so long? The box she had uncovered seemed to hold only fragments of a much larger story, an incomplete narrative, broken and scattered like the lives of those who had once called St. Mary's their home. The key she had found, rusted and old, seemed to belong to something far more significant than any locked drawer or chest in the post office. But what? And where did it fit into the puzzle? The sun had risen higher in the sky as Miss Marple left the post office, the morning light casting a soft glow over the village. She walked slowly, her mind turning over the possibilities, trying to connect the dots. The documents in the box were dated, some nearly a century old, each one a piece of history that had long since been forgotten. As her steps echoed on the cobblestone streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that the discovery was not just about the past. It was about the present, too. Her thoughts returned to the letter, the one that had sparked this investigation. The message had been clear in its cryptic way. Find the truth beneath the floorboards. But it wasn't just the words that lingered in her mind. It was the sense of urgency they had carried. Someone, or something, had wanted those secrets unearthed. But why? She made her way to the village square, where the fountain stood as a silent observer of decades of gossip and gossipers. The square had always been a gathering place for the residents of St. Mary's, a place where news and rumors mingled, where the past was retold and reshaped with each new story. It was here, she knew, that she would find the answers. But the question was, from whom? The local pub, the Crown and Anchor, was quiet this early in the day, its wooden sign swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, a few of the regulars sat at the bar, their hushed conversations mixing with the clinking of glasses. Miss Marple could see that her presence had drawn little attention, for the village was accustomed to her quiet investigations. She had learned long ago that people were far more inclined to talk when they believed they were speaking to someone who would listen, without judgment and without the sense that they were being watched. She made her way to the back corner of the pub, where Mr. Harper, the village historian, sat with a mug of tea. He was a man of few words, but his knowledge of St. Mary's was unmatched. It was said that if you wanted to know the village's secrets, Mr. Harper could provide you with the answers, or at least point you in the right direction. "Good morning, Mr. Harper," Miss Marple greeted him softly, sitting down across from him. His eyes, sharp and knowing, glanced up from his tea, his lips curling into a small smile. "Morning, Miss Marple. I see you're as busy as ever, digging into the village's past," he said, his voice low but filled with curiosity. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze fixed on the man. "I've come across something rather strange, Mr. Harper. It seems there are some things in St. Mary's history that have been buried, not just beneath the earth, but beneath the very walls of the post office. Have you heard anything about the old post office, about its past?" Mr. Harper's brow furrowed slightly, and for a moment Miss Marple saw a flicker of something, fear perhaps, pass across his face. It was fleeting, but it was there. "The post office? It's been there for as long as anyone can remember. Nothing much happens there anymore, not since the days of the Great War. But there were stories, of course, stories about the old days when the post office was more than just a place to send letters." "Stories?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "What kind of stories?" Mr. Harper took a deep breath, then set his cup down with deliberate slowness. The kind that involved people who came and went, people who disappeared and never came back. The post office was once a meeting place, not just for the townsfolk, but for outsiders, for people with secrets. You see, during the war, there were certain transactions that took place in that building. Illegal ones, if you understand me. Miss Marple listened intently, her heart quickening. "Illegal transactions?" "Yes, but they weren't just about money. There were documents exchanged, papers that could ruin lives if they fell into the wrong hands. It was said that some of those who worked in the post office knew things they shouldn't have, things that could expose powerful people." Mr. Harper paused, his eyes shifting around the room as if making sure no one was listening. "The thing is, no one ever talked about it after the war, and when the war ended, well, people just moved on." Miss Marple felt a stirring in her chest. "And these people with secrets, where are they now? Some left town, some stayed. But those who stayed, well, you know how people are. They bury their secrets, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively." A long silence settled between them, the weight of Mr. Harper's words hanging in the air. Miss Marple's mind raced. The post office had once been a place of secrets, of hidden dealings, and it seemed that whatever had been buried beneath its floorboards all those years ago had resurfaced. The letter, the box, the key. Everything was pointing toward something darker than she had originally suspected. "Mr. Harper," Miss Marple said softly, her voice steady, "do you think the secrets of the past are still here, in the village? That they could still be hiding, waiting to be discovered?" He met her gaze, his expression solemn. "I think some things are never really gone, Miss Marple. They're just waiting for the right person to uncover them." The village of St. Mary's had always been a place where the past lingered like the scent of lavender in the air, a soft, comforting presence woven into the fabric of daily life. The cobbled streets, the crooked lanes, and the time-worn houses all seemed to whisper their histories to those who cared to listen. But now, as Miss Marple walked through the quiet lanes, her thoughts were far from peaceful. The discovery beneath the floorboards had stirred something long dormant, a ripple of unease that seemed to spread through the very core of the village. As she made her way back to the post office that afternoon, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that the threads of the past were not simply frayed. They were actively unraveling, revealing secrets meant to stay buried. She had spent the morning thinking over Mr. Harper's words. His account of the old post office being a haven for secret transactions during the war seemed to ring true. But what did it all mean? Why had no one ever spoken of it, and what had they hidden so carefully all these years? The post office, now eerily quiet, stood in sharp contrast to the bustling market square just a few blocks away. Miss Marple approached with measured steps, her eyes scanning the surroundings, always alert to the smallest detail. She could feel it now, the pull of something hidden, as if the very stones of the building were holding their breath. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the scent of old paper lingered in the corners. The familiar, comforting smell of the place, once a hub of gossip and community connection, now seemed tinged with something darker. Mr. Tompkins, the postmaster, was at the counter, looking more flustered than usual. His typically unhurried manner had been replaced by an evident unease. He glanced up at her as she entered, his face pale. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting you so soon," he stammered, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. He looked around nervously, as if expecting someone to be lurking in the shadows. "I thought I might take another look around," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but steady. She stepped toward the back room where she had made her discovery earlier that morning. I don't know if that's a good idea," Mr. Tompkins said, his voice lowering almost to a whisper. "There's been talk. People are starting to notice that, well, strange things are happening, Miss Marple. I thought it was just my nerves, but now—" His words trailed off as he shot another quick glance toward the back. Miss Marple studied him carefully. He was more agitated than she had ever seen him, and it piqued her curiosity further. "What talk?" she asked, her voice calm but probing. "People have been talking about the post office, about the old floorboards, and the letter," he whispered, as if the words themselves were dangerous. "Some say it's a sign. Someone's trying to bring something back. Something best left forgotten." Miss Marple paused. "And you believe this?" "I don't know what to believe anymore," Mr. Tompkins said, wringing his hands. "But there's something wrong about all of this. The letter, the box. I didn't want to get involved, but you're the only one who might know what to do." Miss Marple's gaze softened, and she placed a reassuring hand on the counter. "You've done the right thing by speaking up, Mr. Tompkins. Now let's see what we can uncover together." The postmaster nodded hesitantly, still looking troubled, but he stepped back, allowing Miss Marple to move past him toward the back room. The trapdoor was still there, its wooden surface worn but undisturbed since her last visit. As she knelt beside it, the silence seemed to grow thicker, and she could almost hear the pulse of the building itself, as if it were waiting for something, or someone, to unlock its secrets. With a deep breath, Miss Marple lifted the trapdoor again, and as she descended into the small, dimly lit space below, the air felt heavier, more oppressive. The faint scent of earth and damp wood greeted her, but there was also something else, something unsettling about the darkness that clung to the corners of the room. She stepped forward carefully, her shoes scraping lightly on the wooden planks. The box was still there, just as she had left it, tucked away in the far corner of the hidden space. But now, as her fingers brushed against the rusted metal, something felt different. There was a charge in the air, as though something unseen had shifted, and the truth she was seeking was finally within her grasp. She opened the box once more, her breath catching slightly as her eyes fell on the faded documents, the rusted key, and the thin twine binding the letters together. The letters were more legible now, the smudged ink appearing clearer in the dim light. Miss Marple gingerly untied the twine, unfolding the first letter with care. It was written in the same hasty, shaky handwriting as the others, scratched, almost frantic. The letter spoke of hidden alliances, whispered meetings in the dead of night, and promises made in shadows. It mentioned names that Miss Marple had heard before, but never together in this context. A powerful family from the next town over, involved in trade and dealings that had never reached the public eye. But the most troubling part of the letter was the mention of a betrayal. Someone within the group had been leaking information, and it was that betrayal that had caused the secrecy to fester for so many years. Miss Marple paused, the weight of the revelation sinking in. The past was not simply a collection of forgotten events. It was alive, pulsing in the very walls of the post office. It was as if the secrets had not been buried, but carefully concealed, waiting for the ripe moment to resurface. She gathered the letters together, carefully placing them back in the box, and stood slowly. Her mind raced with the implications of what she had just uncovered. Whoever had written these letters had known the truth, and perhaps still did. The key she had found earlier was no longer just a trinket. It was a key to something more, a door or perhaps a vault that had remained locked for decades. Miss Marple made her way back up the creaky steps, the weight of the box in her hands. The air in the post office felt different now, charged with anticipation. She could sense it. This was only the beginning. The truth was waiting just beneath the surface, and it was only a matter of time before it would all come to light. Miss Marple stood in the dim light of the post office, the box of letters tucked under her arm, as though the weight of it could not be ignored. The room seemed to close in around her, the quietness pressing in from all sides. She had unearthed something, of that she was certain, but now the question was what to do with it. What had been hidden for so long? What had people buried beneath the floorboards of this seemingly ordinary building, and why had it remained untouched for all these years? The answers she sought were so close now, just a few steps away, just a few more pieces to the puzzle. But with each step forward, the mystery seemed to grow more complex, more tangled. She looked at the box in her hands, her fingers brushing over the brittle edges of the paper, and felt the weight of the years settle on her shoulders. These were not just letters. They were pieces of a story that had been written and forgotten, hidden in plain sight. She glanced over at Mr. Tompkins, who stood in the doorway of the back room, his face drawn with concern. He had been standing there for some time now, as though unsure whether to interrupt her or simply allow her to continue her investigation. His nervousness was palpable. The postmaster had always been a man of habit, of routine, but this had unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite explain. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, his voice cracking slightly. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. People are starting to notice things. The way the post office is, well, it's not the same anymore. It feels wrong." She gave him a reassuring smile, one that she knew would offer him little comfort, but it was all she had. "I understand, Mr. Tompkins. I understand better than you think. But sometimes, the truth has a way of slipping through the cracks, only to be found again when it's least expected." She paused, studying his face. "You said people were talking. What exactly are they saying?" Mr. Tompkins hesitated, looking around nervously as though to ensure no one could overhear. "It's the old folk, mostly. They've been talking about the post office like it's some kind of cursed place. Some even claim to have seen things. Strange things in the windows at night. It's all nonsense, I'm sure of it. But they're starting to spread rumors. They say the building's got a history, a dark history, and now, with these letters, well, I fear what's been uncovered. I fear what might happen if we open the wrong door." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "And do you believe it, Mr. Tompkins? Do you believe that the past has returned to haunt this place?" The postmaster shifted uncomfortably, wringing his hands. "I don't know what to believe anymore. It's just... I've lived here all my life, Miss Marple. I've seen the changes, the quiet whispers, the odd disappearances. But none of it makes sense. Not until now." He looked down at the floor, avoiding her gaze. "There's something terrible about what you've found. I can feel it. Miss Marple studied him for a moment, her mind working quickly. She could see the fear in his eyes, the deep unease that had taken root in him, but it wasn't just the letter or the box that had unsettled him. It was something more, something hidden beneath the surface of the post office itself. "Have you ever thought to ask why the building was built this way?" Miss Marple asked, her voice low and deliberate. "Why the floorboards were placed over such a small, concealed space? Why, even now there's a sense of something locked away, waiting to be discovered." Mr. Tompkins looked at her, his expression faltering. "I've never really thought about it, not like you have. I just work here. It's been the same for as long as I can remember." "But there was a time," Miss Marple said softly, "when things were different. Before the war. Before the building became just another post office. You must have heard the stories of the people who came and went, the visitors who were never really seen." Her words hung in the air, and she could see that he was struggling to remember something just beyond his grasp. Something he had tried to forget. "People came to the post office?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. "People who were not from here. People with secrets. People who made deals in the shadows. And someone here, someone who worked at the post office, helped them. Someone who knew what was going on. But who?" Mr. Tompkins shook his head, as though trying to dispel the thoughts she had stirred. "I don't know," he murmured. "It's all so confusing. Why would anyone want to hide anything? Why would they bury it here?" Miss Marple's gaze softened, and she placed a hand gently on his arm. "Sometimes, Mr. Tompkins, the truth is not something that people want to remember. They bury it because it's too painful, too dangerous, but now it's been found, and someone may want to stop it from being uncovered." The postmaster's eyes widened. "You mean someone's trying to hide it again, after all these years?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She was thinking, piecing together what she had learned so far. The letter, the box, the cryptic messages. Someone had gone to great lengths to conceal the truth, even from their own. But why, and who was still protecting it? "We must be careful, Mr. Tompkins," Miss Marple said, her voice firm now. "The truth is a powerful thing, and it's not always in our best interest to uncover it, but sometimes it's necessary." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm going to need your help. There are more questions to be answered, and I fear there's someone in this village who doesn't want them answered." The postmaster looked at her with a mix of fear and determination. "What do you need me to do?" Miss Marple glanced around the room, her gaze lingering on the walls, the corners, the dust-covered shelves. "For now, we wait, but I want you to keep your ears open, Mr. Tompkins. If anyone says anything at all, you must let me know. There's more to this than anyone knows, and the answers are closer than we think." The village of St. Mary's had always prided itself on its quiet, unassuming nature. Life moved at its own pace, as it had for generations, with little to disturb the settled rhythm of its people. But something was changing now, something Miss Marple could feel beneath the surface, a subtle shift, a tension in the air that had not been there before. The secrets buried in the old post office were not the kind to remain hidden forever, and the more she unearthed, the more she realized that the past had a way of reaching into the present, twisting its threads in ways that could not easily be undone. It had been a few days since her conversation with Mr. Tompkins, and though she had spent most of her time in quiet contemplation, piecing together the fragments of the mystery, the silence in the village had become oppressive. The weather, too, seemed to reflect the mood of the town. The days were overcast, the light dim and cold, as though the sun itself had withdrawn in anticipation of something that had yet to come. Miss Marple walked slowly through the streets, her thoughts preoccupied with the discoveries she had made. The box of letters, the key, and the cryptic message had all pointed towards something, a conspiracy of sorts, something much larger than anyone in St. Mary's could have imagined. But there was one piece she had yet to uncover, one question that still gnawed at her. Who had been involved? And who, if anyone, was still trying to conceal the truth? Her steps led her to the village's oldest tavern, the Wagon and Horses, a place where the more seasoned villagers gathered in the evenings to share stories, drink ale, and discuss matters both trivial and serious. She knew that there, among the shadows of the flickering candlelight, she might find a clue, perhaps not in words, but in actions. It was here, after all, that she had learned many of the village's secrets in the past. The tavern was quiet that afternoon, the hum of conversation low and muffled as the locals sat in their usual places. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. Miss Marple made her way to the bar, where the bartender, a stout man named Peter, nodded at her in recognition. She had known him for years, ever since he had taken over the tavern from his father, who had run it before him. There was an unspoken understanding between them. He knew that Miss Marple's visits were not always social, and she knew that he would never pry into her business. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," Peter said, wiping down a glass with a cloth. "The usual." Miss Marple smiled softly, though her mind was elsewhere. "Just a cup of tea, thank you, Peter." He nodded, preparing her tea in silence, his movements efficient and practiced. She could see the quiet tension in his demeanor, the way his eyes darted from one corner of the room to the other, as though he were waiting for something or someone. Once her tea was prepared, Miss Marple took a seat by the fire, her gaze wandering across the room. The usual group of locals sat at their familiar spots, their conversations hushed but intense. She could sense that they were aware of her presence, aware of the recent events that had begun to unsettle the village. She caught sight of a few familiar faces, but none of them met her eye. They were all too absorbed in their own thoughts. She sipped her tea slowly, savoring the warmth as the fire crackled beside her. The silence in the room seemed heavier now, as though everyone was waiting for something to happen. It was then that she noticed the figure sitting at the far end of the room, partially obscured by shadows. He was an older man, with a face that was both familiar and strange. An outsider, someone who had only recently come to the village, though Miss Marple couldn't recall ever seeing him before. His name, she would later learn, was Edward Turner, a man who had been passing through St. Mary's on his way to somewhere else, but who had somehow ended up staying. He had a quiet air about him, and he never seemed to draw attention to himself, though there was something unsettling about him. Something that made people nervous, though no one could ever quite put their finger on why. Miss Marple watched him carefully, noting how he shifted in his seat, as if he were waiting for someone, or perhaps something. She couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more about the village's hidden history than he was letting on. She had seen that look before, the look of someone who had a secret that they were doing their best to keep buried. It was then that he glanced up, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest of moments. There was no recognition in his gaze, but Miss Marple could tell that he knew exactly who she was. She had a reputation, after all, one that preceded her in every village, every town she visited. The village's quiet, unspoken mysteries had always drawn her in, and she had learned long ago how to extract the truths others were too afraid to speak. Without a word, she stood from her seat, her movements slow and deliberate as she made her way toward him. As she approached, he stiffened, his eyes narrowing slightly, though he did not move. Miss Marple took a seat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Mr. Turner," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. "I understand you've been staying in St. Mary's for some time now. I trust you found the village to your liking?" He met her gaze coolly, his expression unreadable. "It's a quiet place," he replied, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "A good place to rest." Miss Marple studied him for a moment, weighing her next words carefully. "There's something about this village," she said, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. something that people are reluctant to speak of. But I get the sense that you know something about it, something that could help me understand what's been happening here." For the first time, his composure faltered, just slightly. His eyes flickered, and in that moment, Miss Marple saw a flash of recognition, followed by something else, something like fear. He cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly, but the way his hand gripped the edge of his glass gave him away. Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her gaze never leaving his. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice firm, "secrets have a way of resurfacing, and when they do, they have a tendency to come with a price." The evening air had turned cold, the shadows stretching long across the village as dusk descended. Miss Marple sat by the window of her cottage, her gaze lost in the quiet of the garden outside. The trees stood bare, their branches like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky, and the garden itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. Though what that something was, she could not yet say. The secrets that had been stirring beneath the surface of St. Mary's were not going to remain hidden for long. She could feel it now, deep in her bones. The conversation with Edward Turner had unsettled her. There was something about the man, something in the way he had reacted to her words that spoke volumes. He had been careful, too careful, masking his discomfort behind a veneer of civility. But Miss Marple had seen the signs. Fear, though expertly hidden, was still fear, and when a person was frightened, they would reveal more than they intended. In that brief exchange, he had unwittingly shown her that he knew more than he was letting on, and that knowledge was not something easily contained. She could not help but wonder what role Turner played in the village's strange history. He had come to St. Mary's recently, with no clear reason, no apparent ties to the place. There were those who had whispered about him, about his oddness, his tendency to keep to himself. But it wasn't just his reclusive nature that piqued her interest. It was his arrival and his sudden desire to stay. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest as her mind turned over the clues she had gathered. Turner's arrival had coincided with the recent stirrings in the village, the gossip, the unease that had begun to seep into the lives of the villagers. The letter, the box beneath the floorboards, the sense that something was buried in St. Mary's, waiting to be uncovered. It all felt like pieces of a larger puzzle, one that Miss Marple was slowly beginning to see take shape. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that her suspicions were not enough. She needed to know more, needed to uncover the truth hidden behind Turner's calm demeanor and the vague rumors that swirled around him. If he knew something, then it was only a matter of time before he would slip, reveal the key to unlocking the mystery that had gripped the village. As the night grew darker, Miss Marple made her decision. She would not wait for him to come to her. Instead, she would go to him. There was one place where he would be most likely to reveal himself, and that was the Wagon and Horses. The tavern had always been a place where secrets were shared, albeit under the guise of casual conversation, and she had no doubt that Turner would be there again. It was, after all, the one place in St. Mary's where strangers could blend in without drawing too much attention to themselves. She stood, smoothing the wrinkles in her skirt, and made her way toward the door. The streets were quiet, the evening air cool against her face as she walked the short distance to the tavern. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the stillness, a solitary rhythm that seemed to match the steady beat of her heart. She knew what she had to do. She had no time to waste. When she reached the Wagon and Horses, she paused outside, taking a moment to steady herself before stepping inside. The warmth of the tavern enveloped her immediately, and the murmur of voices and the clink of glasses provided a familiar, comforting backdrop. As she made her way to the bar, her eyes quickly scanned the room, looking for him. There, near the far end of the room, sitting alone at a table by the window, was Edward Turner. He had his back to her, but she could tell by the set of his shoulders that he was aware of her presence even before she had made it to his table. He didn't look up immediately, but there was a slight shift in his posture that told her everything she needed to know. He was waiting. Miss Marple moved toward him, her steps deliberate, confident. She took a seat across from him without asking, her gaze fixed on him as she settled in. There was no need for pleasantries, no need for formal introductions. She knew what needed to be said. "Mr. Turner," she began, her voice calm but unwavering. "I'm afraid our previous conversation was only the beginning of a much larger story." He met her gaze then. His eyes narrowed slightly, as though he had been expecting this moment. "I don't know what you mean," he replied, his voice smooth, but Miss Marple could hear the underlying tension. "Oh, I think you do," she said gently, folding her hands in front of her. "I think you know exactly what I mean. The post office, the letters, the key, the history of this village. It's all connected, isn't it? And you, Mr. Turner, are right at the center of it." Turner's fingers twitched, the slightest movement, but it was enough. She had caught him. He was more unsettled than he let on. For a moment, he didn't speak, and the silence between them stretched thick and heavy. Miss Marple could see him weighing his options, deciding whether to deny or to admit. Finally, he leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "What do you want from me, Miss Marple?" "I want the truth," she replied, her voice steady. "All of it. Whatever you know, whatever you've been keeping hidden. Because I can assure you, Mr. Turner, there is no escaping the past. Not here, not in St. Mary's." He let out a slow breath, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw a flicker of resignation in his eyes. The facade was beginning to crack. "You don't know what you're asking for," he said quietly, his voice now betraying a hint of vulnerability. "Some things are best left buried. You're too close now. I can't let you uncover it." Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. "The truth has a way of coming to light, whether we want it to or not." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their words hanging between them. The tavern buzzed around them, but for Miss Marple, the rest of the world had faded into the background. She was on the verge of something that would finally reveal the mystery of St. Mary's, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. The next few days in St. Mary's passed with a strange, palpable tension that seemed to linger in the air, thick and unnerving. Miss Marple couldn't help but feel the weight of what she had uncovered, as though the very village itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to give. She had never before encountered such resistance to the truth. People here were usually content to bury their secrets, to let time dull the edges of uncomfortable history. But now, there was a sense of urgency, a feeling that something was about to break, and Miss Marple knew it had to do with Edward Turner. She had seen it in his eyes during their conversation in the tavern. His cool exterior, the calm voice, the controlled demeanor, they had all cracked for a moment when she had pressed him on his knowledge of the village's dark past. For just a second, he had looked like a man on the edge, someone who had been living with a truth that was slowly eating away at him. And despite his best efforts to remain composed, Miss Marple knew he was running out of time to protect the secrets he so desperately clung to. The more she thought about it, the more Miss Marple realized that Turner had not been the only one hiding something. There were other figures in St. Mary's too, whose lives were intertwined with the old post office, with its buried history. The more she uncovered, the more certain she became that the village itself was a puzzle, its pieces scattered throughout the lives of its residents. But how did they all fit together? Who else was involved in this web of secrets? She had not seen Turner since their meeting in the wagon and horses. His absence had not gone unnoticed. No one seemed to have seen him around, and the tavern had grown quieter in his absence. He had disappeared, vanishing into the shadows of the village as quickly as he had arrived. Miss Marple had her suspicions about where he might have gone, but she couldn't act on them just yet. She needed more. The next morning, she decided to visit the post office again, hoping that something might have changed, that some clue might reveal itself if she looked carefully enough. As she approached the building, she noticed that the door was slightly ajar, a faint creak of wood emanating from within. There was no sign of Mr. Tompkins, the postmaster, which was unusual for that time of day. He was always there, opening the doors promptly, ready to start the morning's work. Curiosity piqued, Miss Marple stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the worn wooden floors. The room was eerily still, the usual hum of activity absent. The shelves were lined with parcels and letters, their edges yellowed with age. But there was no sign of the postmaster. She moved toward the back of the room, her senses alert to every sound, every flicker of movement. As she passed the counter, she noticed something odd. A small, leather-bound notebook lying on the floor near the door to the storage room. It was open, as if someone had dropped it in haste, and the pages were filled with hurried, scribbled notes. Miss Marple knelt down to examine it, her fingers grazing the pages carefully. The handwriting was familiar, too familiar. It was Mr. Tompkins's, but the words were far more frantic than she had ever seen in his usual neat, methodical script. There was something disjointed about the writing, as if he were trying to organize his thoughts, but had been interrupted. The words on the page were a jumble of names, dates, and phrases that didn't seem to make sense at first glance, but Miss Marple recognized a pattern. References to the post office, to hidden transactions, and to a long-forgotten scandal that had somehow tied itself to the village's history. Her heart quickened. The notebook was a key, a vital clue that would lead her closer to the truth. She flipped through the pages, each one more revealing than the last, until she reached a final entry, written in a shakier hand than the others. The words on the page were chilling. It's happening again. The past won't stay buried. Turner knows. He has to be stopped. The realization hit Miss Marple like a jolt of electricity. Turner had known more than she had realized. He had not only been involved, but he had also been trying to stop whatever was unfolding in St. Mary's. And now he had gone into hiding, perhaps fearing that the truth was finally about to be unearthed. Miss Marple stood up quickly, her mind racing with possibilities. She had to find Turner, and she had to find him now. The notebook was a confirmation of everything she had suspected. The village's dark past was not just a relic of history. It was alive, and it was moving once again. Turner had been right to be afraid. The secrets buried beneath the floorboards of the post office were not just about old alliances or forgotten betrayals. They were about power, about people who would stop at nothing to protect what they had hidden for so long. She left the post office swiftly, her thoughts turning over what she had just read. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still so much to uncover. As she walked through the streets of the village, she couldn't help but feel that time was running out. Whoever was behind the conspiracy had made their move, and now it was up to Miss Marple to stop them before the past claimed even more victims. Her steps quickened as she approached the edge of town, where Turner had been seen last. There was a small cottage there, nestled at the edge of a thicket, one that had been empty for years. She had never paid it much attention before, but now it seemed to beckon to her, as though it were the place where everything would be revealed. She hesitated at the door, her hand resting on the knob, and then pushed it open, stepping inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old wood and damp earth filled her nostrils. It was quiet, too quiet, and in the silence, Miss Marple felt the weight of the past closing in around her. Somewhere, hidden in the shadows of this place, was the truth, and she was determined to find it. The cottage was as silent as the grave, its heavy stone walls holding within them the secrets of years long forgotten. Miss Marple stepped carefully inside, the floorboards creaking under her feet, disturbed by the weight of her presence. The air was thick with dust, but there was something else too, a subtle scent that clung to the place, an unmistakable smell of old paper, of memories trapped in time. She had seen many abandoned homes in her years of investigating, but this one felt different. It felt as though someone had left in a hurry, as though something had been hastily concealed. The single room of the cottage was sparsely furnished, the few pieces of furniture worn from years of neglect. A rickety wooden table sat in the center, piled high with old papers, some of them yellowed with age. Miss Marple approached it slowly, her fingers hovering over the stacks as she scanned them. They were all letters that had been carefully preserved, though the handwriting was faint and difficult to decipher. The weight of the years pressed down on each word, but Miss Marple could sense their importance. These were the missing pieces, the fragments of a history that had been deliberately kept out of sight. She carefully unfolded one of the letters, its edges brittle with age. The writing was faint, but she could make out the name at the top, Richard Holt. Miss Marple paused, the name striking her with an unexpected force. She had heard the name before, many years ago. Richard Holt had been a prominent figure in St. Mary's, a businessman whose name had once been whispered in the same breath as the town's wealthiest families. His sudden disappearance had been the subject of hushed conversations in the village, but no one had ever dared to ask too many questions. The official story had been that he had moved away, but Miss Marple had always suspected there was more to the story. Now, it seemed she was about to find out. She read the letter carefully, her mind working to connect the dots. The words were cryptic, but it was clear that Holt had been involved in something far larger than the business dealings for which he was known. There were references to meetings in the dead of night, to a plan that was set in motion long before the war, and to something being hidden, something that could destroy lives if it were ever brought to light. The letter ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she set the letter down. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but there was still so much more to uncover. She glanced around the room, her eyes drawn to a small chest in the corner, partially obscured by a faded curtain. It was made of dark wood, the surface scratched and worn, but something about it caught her attention. She crossed the room quickly, her pulse quickening as she knelt beside it. The chest was locked, but Miss Marple knew that it would not remain locked for long. She reached into her bag and pulled out the small, rusted key she had found in the post office. It fit perfectly into the lock, and with a small click, the chest was open. Inside, she found a collection of carefully wrapped parcels, each one labeled with a name. As she unwrapped them, her breath caught in her throat. The contents were photographs, old and faded, but still recognizable. They were images of Richard Holt, yes, but there were others too. People she recognized from the village, people who had been part of the town's social fabric for decades. They were gathered in various locations, around the post office, at the edge of the woods, in a room Miss Marple had never seen before, a room that seemed to pulse with an eerie presence. The photographs were chilling in their own right, but it was the faces of the people in them that left Miss Marple unsettled. There was a look in their eyes, a coldness that spoke of hidden agendas and whispered promises. These were not just ordinary village folk. They were part of something much larger, something far more dangerous. And they had been conspiring for years. As she looked through the photographs, one in particular caught her attention. It was a group shot, taken in front of a building she did not recognize. The men and women in the picture were dressed formally, but their expressions were anything but celebratory. They looked like soldiers, poised and ready, as though they were preparing for something dark and imminent. And standing in the center of the group was a man Miss Marple knew all too well, Edward Turner. The realization struck her with a force that left her breathless. Turner had not just been a passive observer in all of this. He had been a part of it, perhaps even its leader. He had played a role in the same conspiracy that had been unfolding for decades, hidden in plain sight within the quiet village of St. Mary's. And now, Miss Marple understood why he had been so desperate to keep the truth buried. The stakes were higher than she had imagined. The power and influence these people had wielded, The web they had spun was far from over. Turner had been trying to prevent the past from resurfacing, but it seemed that he, too, had underestimated the truth's ability to rise to the surface. Miss Marple stood, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. The village, which had always seemed so peaceful, so serene, was anything but. It was a place built on secrets, on betrayals, on alliances formed in the shadows. And now, the truth was breaking free, and there would be no way to stop it. She closed the chest with a soft click and stood silently for a moment, her mind racing. She had the answers she needed, but the question now was how to bring them to light. Who could she trust, and how much of the past was still lurking, waiting to strike again? There was no turning back now. The pieces were all in place, and the truth, however dangerous it might be, was waiting to be revealed. All she had to do was decide who would hear it, and when. The wind had picked up as dusk settled over St. Mary's, its chill biting through the air, but Miss Marple barely noticed. She walked with purpose, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts as she made her way down the familiar lanes of the village. The weight of the past was heavy upon her, the revelations from the chest in the cottage pressing against her like a storm ready to break. The photographs, the letters, and the faces, all of it was coming together, forming a picture that was clearer than she had ever hoped for. But the question still remained. What now? As she walked, her thoughts turned to Edward Turner. She had suspected for a long time that he knew more than he let on. But the truth was more damning than she could have imagined. Turner had been at the heart of something far darker than she had ever suspected. Something that went beyond the boundaries of St. Mary's, beyond the petty secrets and the occasional scandal. He had been involved in a network of influence and corruption, a group of people who had held the village, and perhaps much more, in their grasp. Their reach was long, and their power was insidious. But as much as she had learned, as much as she had pieced together, there was still one thing that eluded her. Why? Why had they done it? Why had they kept this web of deception going for so long? And why had they chosen to involve St. Mary's of all places? The village was small, insignificant even in the grand scheme of things. But that was the thing about secrets. They often thrived in the quietest of places, hidden away where no one would think to look. The answer, Miss Marple realized, had been right in front of her all along. St. Mary's wasn't just a random village. It had been a crossroads, a place where power could be manipulated, where deals could be made under the cover of anonymity. The post office, with its quiet location and its unsuspicious nature, had been the perfect front. And Turner, with his cool demeanor and his subtle charm, had been the perfect man to protect those secrets. Her steps grew quicker as she neared the edge of town. The house she sought stood at the end of the village, its silhouette barely visible against the darkening sky. It had once belonged to one of the wealthiest families in the area, though they had long since moved away, leaving the place to crumble. The house had been abandoned for years, but tonight, Miss Marple knew, it would be anything but empty. Tonight, it would be the site of a reckoning. She had to act quickly. The truth had a way of slipping through the cracks, but it also had a way of catching up with those who tried to bury it. Turner, for all his careful planning, had underestimated her. He had underestimated the persistence of the past, the way it could claw its way back into the light, no matter how deep it was buried. When Miss Marple reached the house, she didn't hesitate. The door was unlocked, just as she had expected. She stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight, and she immediately felt the weight of the house settle around her, as though the walls themselves were waiting for something to happen. The air inside was musty, the scent of decay mingling with the faint remnants of something more sinister. She moved quietly through the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence, until she reached the room at the back of the house. It was there that she found Turner. He was standing by the fireplace, his back to her, staring into the flames. His face was drawn, his features hard and set, but there was no mistaking the tension in his posture. He had been expecting her. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, almost weary. "I suppose I should have known you would come." "You've been running from the truth for far too long, Mr. Turner," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice steady, unwavering. "But you can't outrun it forever." He didn't turn to face her, but she could hear the subtle shift in his movements, the way he exhaled as though trying to gather his thoughts. "I never wanted any of this," he said after a long pause. "You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to go this far." "It's already gone too far," Miss Marple replied, stepping closer. "You knew from the beginning what you were protecting. You knew the cost of keeping these secrets, and you chose to pay it anyway. Now, the rest of us will pay the price for your silence." Turner finally turned to face her, his eyes dark with regret, but there was no fear there. Just an overwhelming weariness, as though he had fought this battle for far too long. "I had no choice," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They would have destroyed everything, all of it, the village, the people, even you, Miss Marple." "You should have trusted the truth," she said softly, her gaze unwavering. "Because no matter how hard we try to bury it, it always finds its way to the surface." He looked away, his jaw clenched, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might speak again. But he remained silent, as though the weight of his own words had finally become too much to bear. The silence hung between them, thick and suffocating, until Miss Marple broke it once more. "You may have thought you were protecting this village, Mr. Turner, but in the end, you've only delayed the inevitable. The past is never truly gone. It just waits for the right moment to rise again. And that moment has come." Turner's face hardened, but Miss Marple could see the flicker of something, perhaps regret, perhaps acceptance in his eyes. He knew the game was up. He had played his part, and now the truth would be revealed, no matter how much it cost. Miss Marple turned toward the door, her mind already focused on the next steps. The truth had a way of making itself known, and there would be no stopping it now. As she walked back into the cool night air, she felt the weight of the village's secrets lift just a little as the past began to make its presence known. It was only a matter of time before the rest of St. Mary's would learn what she had uncovered, and when they did, nothing would ever be the same again. The final revelation was never as clean-cut as one might expect. In St. Mary's, the shadows had been long, the whispers too soft to catch on first pass, but Miss Marple had always known that the truth, in all its murkiness, would come to light. And now, as she stood at the center of it all, the intricate web of lies, betrayal, and manipulation that had entangled the village for so long was slowly unraveling. It was late in the evening when the villagers gathered at the town hall, the air thick with murmurs of unease. The once quiet village had stirred with unrest over the past few days, rumors swelling like the tide before a storm. People had begun to piece together the fragments of stories, and the truth was already out there, in the streets, in the eyes of those who had long looked the other way. No one knew exactly what would happen next, but they knew something had to give. Miss Marple arrived at the town hall just as the doors were closing, the sound of voices carrying from within. She knew the room would be packed. Everyone wanted answers, and she was the one who would give them. As she walked into the hall, she could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, their anticipation hanging heavy in the air. "Miss Marple," Mr. Tompkins greeted her, his voice shaky, his face pale. "Are you sure about this? We don't know how they'll react." Miss Marple nodded, her expression steady. "The truth can be difficult to hear, but it's better than living in the dark. They deserve to know, Mr. Tompkins. All of them." She stepped forward, the room falling into a hushed silence as she addressed the gathering. "My dear friends," Miss Marple began, her voice calm but resolute, "I know you have all heard the rumors, the whispers that have filled the streets in recent days. The stories of betrayal, of secrets buried beneath the surface of our quiet village, have spread faster than I had anticipated. And while I wish I could tell you that none of it is true, that St. Mary's has been untouched by the shadows of the past. I cannot. The crowd shifted uneasily, the air thick with tension. She could feel the weight of their gazes, the doubts, the confusion, all laced with a sense of betrayal. Miss Marple paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. Edward Turner, whom you all know, is not the man he claimed to be. He came to this village not as a stranger seeking peace, but as someone with a deep connection to the dark history we have all been too quick to forget. He was involved in something far greater than just a few shady dealings. He was part of a network, a group of powerful individuals who sought to control not just the wealth of St. Mary's, but the very essence of its people. She glanced at the back of the room where Turner now stood, his face drawn and unreadable. The same man who had been so careful, so composed in their previous encounters, was now visibly shaken, his shoulders hunched, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He was trying to remain stoic, but Miss Marple could see the cracks forming beneath his carefully constructed facade. As I discovered, she continued, Turner's involvement goes back to the days before the war. He was part of a conspiracy that sought to control not just the resources of our village, but its very soul. The post office, which seemed so innocuous to all of us, was the center of these dealings, a hub for correspondence that never made its way into the public eye. And there, hidden beneath the floorboards, were the remnants of this dark history. Letters, photographs, names of those who had conspired together in the shadows. A murmur ran through the crowd as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, and Miss Marple could sense the weight of disbelief in the room. They had all known something was off. Something had felt wrong, but no one had dared to ask the questions that now seemed so obvious. But that is not the most troubling part, Miss Marple added, her voice steady. What's truly alarming is that this conspiracy was not something of the past. It is alive, and it has been waiting for the right moment to strike again. The web of influence that Turner was a part of is still in motion, and it was only a matter of time before someone came looking to finish what was started. A chill swept through the room as the realization settled in. The conspiracy had not died with the end of the war. It had merely been hidden, waiting for the right opportunity to resurface. At this, Miss Marple turned to face Turner directly. "You thought you could stop it, didn't you, Mr. Turner?" she asked softly, her eyes locking with his. "You thought you could bury it all, hide it forever, but the truth always finds its way to the surface, and now it's your turn to answer for your part in it." Turner's eyes darted briefly to the ground, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I never wanted this. I never wanted any of it, but when you're in too deep, it's hard to get out. I did what I thought was necessary to protect the village, to protect myself, but I can't undo what's been done." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze softening just slightly. "The past can be a powerful force, Mr. Turner, but it doesn't have to define us. Not unless we let it." The room remained silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Miss Marple turned her attention to the villagers, her voice firm. "You may not have known about this, but now you do, and it is up to all of us, together, to decide what happens next. We can choose to let these secrets destroy us, or we can choose to face them, to rebuild our community on the truth. The decision is yours." There was a long pause, but as Miss Marple looked out, over the crowd, she could see something stirring within them, something more than fear or confusion. It was resolve. They had been given the truth no matter how painful it was, and now they had the power to move forward. Together, they could break the cycle of secrecy that had plagued their village for so long. One by one, the villagers began to speak, their voices tentative at first, but growing stronger as they realized the weight of their own power. The truth had been revealed, and now it was their responsibility to ensure it would never again be buried. And as Miss Marple stood there, watching the villagers slowly come together, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction settle over her. The case was closed, The truth had triumphed, and St. Mary's, for all its dark history, would begin anew